So, Zach, it's really good to see you again. Last time we spoke, we started to have a conversation about the impact of Gen AI that I thought was super interesting. And I think we have similar outlooks. And if I were going to characterize them, I would say we're pretty. So it depends on how you look at it. I'm very optimistic on the power of Gen AI. I am very concerned about what it's going to do to society, to the job market. And of course, my touch point is product development, tech, and I just see massive disruption down the pike. I think it's already started. That's my view. Um, but our conversation went all over the place, which I think is great. But I understand that you have recently done an experiment as a kind of UX person. And maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So great to be here. Great to see you again. Um, I am also working in UX and UI development. So the lens that I look at it through in terms of AI, Gen AI disruption is very similar, I think, to yours. Um, and also from the perspective that it's the kind of technology that could provide a ton of leverage to people who will absorb it and embrace it and utilize it, whereas people who don't quite have that perspective might get pretty rapidly left behind because one thing important to note is just the rapid pace of change and development is it's relatively unique in terms of any other paradigm shift in my experience. Like the landscape is just shifting so rapidly. So I feel it's very important to keep your finger on the pulse and understand what's going on. So one of the most interesting tools that it's been on my radar and I've been playing around with is a tool called Cursor, which is an IDE, so an integrated development environment that has AI built in. So it's just based on VS Code. So there's nothing really innovative around what they've done from like a code editor perspective, but they've just been really intelligent in terms of bringing AI into the product and allowing you to use natural language to program in a way that kind of lets it query documentation, look through pages that you've already created, just in a way that you can kind of do a similar thing with ChatGPT or with Claude, but the structure I think is very important here.
Yeah, it's an
So
integrated experience, right? You're not going
yeah,
to the browser and an editor.
exactly. Yeah, and critically, like it actually really it writes code for you. So I have this feature called Composer, which I've utilized quite a lot. You really need to figure out a way, like how you actually navigate through the platform. But Composer, say you give it a natural language prompt, you tell it you like to build this thing, and it will actually write all of the code for you. It will create all the pages, create the structure. It'll give you instruction in terms of what dependencies you need to install. So really, like for someone that doesn't have any development experience, you can go in there with an idea as long as you're able to ask it something in like clear natural language. The output will be pretty damn good. And
And
I've
what did
used
you
it.
generate? Tell everybody what you did.
Yeah, so I thought of a challenge that would just kind of be a good litmus test for whether or not someone with my level of development experience could actually build a fully functioning application. So I built a basically a clone of ChatGPT. So that queries OpenAI's API. It pulls in text, it streams it in a really nice looking UI, and it has persistence of chat. You have chat history, authentication. I actually connected it up to Stripe as well. So the scaffolding is in place if I wanted to have different users at different pricing points with a different experience. So I might be able to provide them with a pro level experience versus a free level experience, for example. And all of that connectivity I did using natural language. I wrote very few lines of code myself, and it looks very good and it functions really nicely.
And how would you characterize your coding ability before you did this?
It's a great question. So, like, I've worked closely with software engineers and I've done some website development. So I understand HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But I've written very little code. Like I generally use the low code or no code tools, or more recently, I've been using tools like ChatGPT or Claude to actually generate the code for me. So I'd say novice, like amateur at best. I'd be in like the Pythons for dummies
Yeah.
um,
You were
level
not a
of
coder.
coding
You had
experience.
never written an
I'm
entire
not a
program. You've
programmer.
never gone through and written a sorting algorithm or like all
Absolutely
the
not.
stuff computer science. And,
No.
yeah, I
Yeah, and
find
that's
that
a critical
really,
point actually, because I don't really understand like the even the architecture behind an app, but I found, say, like that I think would introduce a lot of efficiency to the process if I knew exactly how I wanted maybe like a database to be structured or something else to be structured. But even without that knowledge, I was able to pull together a fully functioning application, which is very interesting.
and I don't know if they're doing it now. I think it's a natural next step, which will be to just point it at an implementation and say, explain this thing to me. And
Mhm.
I did start my career as a developer. And one of the worst things that can happen to you is like inheriting the code of somebody else. So
Mhm.
I worked in these huge like mainframe environments where some of the code was like 10 years old. And there were just things that people refused to touch. And so it'll be interesting to see if Cursor does it. If not, I'm sure you could take some of the code or point us to some stuff and have ChatGPT and say, explain the structure of this application to a 10-year-old. And it will
Mhm.
just like lay it out. It will generate the documentation. And I think, my key takeaway from this is if somebody with no coding experience can go and recode ChatGPT, like
Mhm.
re-implement, let's call it that, ChatGPT. I heard an interview with Eric Schmidt not too long ago where he was talking about soon you'll just be able to say, I want TikTok except for realtors. And it will just
Mm.
generate it and it will be scalable, all that stuff, that you want it to do. And you'll be able to go in and say, by default, I want people to only be able to update one video a day or whatever. And, we're getting to the point that the friction, the resistance between an idea and scalable implementation, certainly like an MVP, is just
Mhm.
going to evaporate. It's not going to be there. That's my guess. And that somebody imagine what you could have done if you were a coder, if you knew
Mm.
all this stuff. Because I'm able to code, I use ChatGPT to write some VB scripts to like consolidate information in spreadsheets and do all this stuff. If I weren't a coder, I wouldn't have been able to do it because it's
Mhm.
still messy. You get compile errors and all this stuff. And I think you would need to, like, to me, that's natural. I understood it. I understand code. I can code if I want to. So, yeah, I think this basically just validates what we were talking about on our first description, which is I think the people who think this won't be very disruptive are just either really so biased that they're blinded or they haven't really played with it or
Mm.
used it. That's my guess.
Yeah. No, I'd have to totally agree with you on that. And I guess maybe an interesting place to go from here is also just kind of thinking around, well, how does the if what you said just earlier was is true, where the gap between an idea and then like a workable MVP evaporates, how does that change the landscape? Because there have been some really interesting things in the news as well recently around how just for example, I think Klarna was one company that they decided to stop using Salesforce and Workday, and they built their own internal Salesforce and Workday replicas specifically tailored to their use case, and their development teams were powered by these generative AI tools. So that's quite an extreme case where they're kind of pulling out these big incumbent legacy software providers and deciding to build their own equivalents. And not everyone will have the kind of engineering depth to be able to do that. But it does kind of raise an interesting question around where does the market go, especially the software as a service, when a small team of people can hypothetically recreate one of these behemoth companies in terms of like the app and the functionality itself in a very short time scale, and how that will just change the overall dynamic.
Well, I think that's interesting. And I think if you've been in product or development very long, I don't know how you can ignore this. We all know that the average customer, let's say, let's say 20%. most of the applications you use, you're using 20% of the functionality. I have like video editing software that I use 1%. It's just so powerful. It's built for professionals. I use 1 or 2% of its capability. And what these companies are doing are just recreating the 1 or 2% or the 20%, let's say, of the application that they need, adjusting it for some of their processes. And, you know, there are a lot of interesting implications. And one of them is what I was talking about earlier, where you can just go to an arbitrary application or piece of code and figure out how it works, how it's structured, is huge. Because I guess I hadn't thought of this before. I think what we will see is just like you can go into like this kind of chat GPT marketplace and you will find 1,000 GPTs about gardening or any other topic. There will be a place where people just kind of open source it or monetize it for almost next to nothing, where they say, this is our CRM. It's really simple. This is what it does. If you choose to, you will be able to download their implementation. You will ask one of these things, how it works, what the dependencies are. It will just tell you everything you need to know about it. You will say, well, I also need to add some fields and I need a mobile experience, and it will just do it. So, you know, in terms of like the traditional app paradigm, we are moving to a world where just anybody can generate this stuff. College students, people that are bored at home, will be able to create this TikTok for gamers or whatever they want to do. They will make the entire implementation available. You can take it and do with it what you want. And yeah, that is going to put tremendous pressure. There will still be instances like, I don't want to just download my accounts receivable software from some teenager in wherever, right? I want a vendor, but their role changes so that now what they're doing is in high assurance, like critical scenarios, they put the stamp of approval, they stand behind the code. But for other things that aren't as critical, and that's a lot, things like Slack, WhatsApp, whatever, you can just generate your own thing. You can, you know, pretty soon there'll be plenty of cyber expertise on cybersecurity, right? You'll be able to say, I want this thing encrypted. I want it locked down so nobody else can get in there. And yeah, the implementation becomes trivial.
Absolutely.
Yeah. To me, that's fascinating because we'll still be left with the problem that even today, the implementation isn't the hard part. I'm a product guy. The hard part is taking it to market and building a business.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah. That's by far the most difficult component of it. It requires the engineering, but yeah, bringing it to market will become. Would you say then that it would become even more important? Like if say the engineering and maybe even the design becomes relatively commoditized or easily generated or augmented by AI, then I guess the focus will shift even further towards like how you actually stand up an organization to sell it, what's your go-to-market strategy, all the other business components around the product itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting because this is still a problem. If you look at tech startups, they get enamored of the technology very often. It's very hard to launch your product and make it successful. So there's a big tendency to over-index on the part of it that we understand, which is implementation. And I see so many startups, and I've done it myself, build stuff. And then as you get towards the end, you're like, okay, now how are we going to market this thing? So I wonder if it will really increase the emphasis on that. It might. It's going to remove a lot of distractions. It's going to be like, okay, we have this thing developed. Yeah, I guess it will. Now what we really need are people know how to take this to market and make it successful. So yeah, absolutely. And I think from a product management perspective, I've been preaching that a lot lately, that, you know, it's going to go in a lot of directions. There will be some product managers who become these like prototypers and high-level implementers. They will work with 1 or 2 engineers who handle exceptions and do really tough stuff, but they will build the apps. That's one path. But I think most of the people who are product managers today, the ones that are going to be able to find jobs will be much more business oriented. And probably the
Mm.
first business skill you should develop is around go to market. You should understand how you position, market, sell something. And then that drives a lot of other topics about, okay, now how do we think about revenue? How do we do all these other things?
Mhm. Well, so I mean, how do you see the product management function specifically, or even just product development in general? Like, say the current kind of paradigm with where you have design, you have engineering, you have customer success, you have sales, then you have product management that kind of bridges all of those different functions and brings them together, and stewards the product forward. And that's maybe my unsophisticated take on product management. But
No,
so
I
correct me if
can
I'm
say.
wrong there. But how would you say that kind of dynamic changes, if there is, I guess, yeah, you have these tools that are they're able to powerfully generate or at least augment like significant components of those teams.
So I think there will be pressure on the traditional product manager to become like a general manager, much more business
Mm.
oriented. I think there will be some role that is product management like in that it's more functional than technical, who does most of the implementation and does a lot of the discovery and the engagement, understands the market, does all this stuff. But instead of like handing over requirements or specifications to engineering, they build it. You know,
Mm.
there's a small team. Some of them are a little more outward facing, but as a group, they build this thing. And when they hit some barrier, that something isn't working in the tool that they're using, let's say cursor throws an error, or you need to do
Yeah.
some very specific integration, or you really need to maximize performance on some area, there will be this small group of engineers. So product managers will become, a lot of them, there will be far fewer jobs, but they will become general managers. There will be
Mhm.
some functional role that does a lot of the implementation. There will be a few engineers that really handle the tough part, but even their productivity is going to go way up. So what I foresee is like some of these people, this kind of solopreneur, this like, just having consultants who come in. So you may have one person who is like on retainer with a few companies, a few products, and their job as an engineer is to mainly handle exceptions, to do a little bit of the design, to keep people from painting themselves in a corner, but they may not even be full-time employees because you will have this ability. One of the barriers you have today is it can take you years to understand a code base, to go in and
Mhm.
figure out what this thing is doing. And partially, that's a product of people writing very bad code and structuring it. Some of that is, sloppiness at the beginning. Some of it is this stuff evolves and we make
Mhm.
changes without understanding the implications. But in a world where this stuff is generated and we can assume ostensibly like well structured and stuff, you're not this long knowledge, understanding this code base becomes a lot less valuable because somebody
Mhm.
can just go in and start interrogating. And in an hour, they know how this whole thing works. It's laid
Yeah.
out in a reasonably logical way. It's not
Mhm.
near as sloppy as it used to be. So, yeah, I can see these product teams that are really, to your kind of point earlier, where there's this general manager who, instead of kind of having one foot in the technical world, has one foot in go to market. I don't think they're really a marketer. I don't
Mhm.
think they'll be a salesperson, but those activities will take a lot more of their time.
That's a really good point. I mean, I've heard some people say that product marketing actually shouldn't be separated at all from like your general kind of marketing or sales strategy. They're very, very intertwined. The whole notion of product-led growth. So I'd have to agree with a lot of what you said just there. Um, I mean, it is super interesting in terms of how do the shapes of these teams actually change. And two points I'll kind of bring up, and I'd love to get your thoughts on them. So one would be, it seems like we're even maybe moving even further away from a hyper specialized world. So previously, like it was very, very important to have a certain specialization. You had to go very, very deep in that. Um, and then more recently, I'd say that the classic kind of T-shaped skill set where you are broadly skilled in a large number of things, and then you go deep in maybe one or two areas, has become even more valuable. But it seems like this is even flattening that out further. Like if you have tools that can kind of take you from being at a surface level of proficiency, but kind of enough of an expert that you can speak the language, you can understand it, you can connect it to other domains, then one of these tools like might take me from having a surface level engineering understanding to actually being able to be quite deep and efficient and functional within that role. So generalism broadly, like just being able to really understand a broad range of different things, and having that multidisciplinary generalist mindset might become even more valuable to something like building product. So I'll stop there and maybe get your reaction to that.
Now, I mean, my head is spinning. I don't know what is going to happen, but I think now we just assume, there's this like functional technical distinction. Product managers, marketers, salespeople are functional. They don't know about the implementation. There's a whole group of technical people whose job is to implement and know about the implementation. And I think what we're seeing, this is oversimplified, but we are going to see the commoditization of this technical part, this implementation. So take it to the extreme and imagine just the implementation really is trivial. Anything you can think of, you can implement. The valuable skills, the people who are going to win are the ones who really know how to take it to market and understand those skills. So it is, in a sense, broadening the top of the T, except that it's not just about like I have a foot or I know something about all the different product management things. It's like throughout the life cycle, through everything, implementation, the functional side of it, I cover all those things. But what is going to determine whether I win or not, and this is really the case today, that's not changing that much, is whether I know how to take this stupid thing to market.
To market, yeah.
There's so many products that get built and just can't be sold. I have said that, I probably said that in our first conversation, that most of the startups I talk to, I feel like they're smart people, they have good ideas. With enough people and trucks, they can implement anything. Where they fail is getting it in front of enough people to sustain themselves. That's what I see. Yeah. They did not think about go-to-market. So they simply can't get traction. They can't get in front of enough people. If they could, they would be more successful. They might have a viable business. So I guess that is something for people to think about. And it sounds extreme, but I've written this in posts like, hey, if you're studying computer science, study something else. I mean, there are going to be a few people who are going to have to build these frameworks and do all that stuff. There's no doubt. There's still going to be engineers who work on these things. They're going to be far fewer of them. That's my position. Same thing for product and then design. I mean, you would think design of the disciplines that we've spoken about is the one that requires the most. I think like there's science to it, but also a lot of art. The talent, that is probably least replaceable in some sense. But at the same time, there are a lot of basic patterns, like 80% of a UI is not being creative and doing, it's really pretty straightforward. So you might have somebody who needs to come along and look at the thing end to end and optimize it and do all this stuff. But I think software will be able to do that too. It'll be able to look at the onboarding process. I've written about this. It's on my blog. You'll just have automated stuff that says, hey, I'm detecting friction here. I suggest we do an A/B test where we reduce the blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And I would suggest if we find that it reduces friction 30%, we make it a permanent change. Do you agree? Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Boom. It sets up the A/B test. It runs the stuff. It may, send you an email and say, hey, remember, so the change I made is working. It's reducing friction. People are onboarding faster. Would you like to make this change permanent? Yes, boom. So nobody, I wrote this today, nobody is safe.
Nobody is safe. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Zach, it was wonderful. Like, I don't know what this is. I think we interviewed each other, which I think is interesting.
A little,
I may publish this on I think this is a great format. Like, it's kind of like a podcast, but You're not sure whose podcast it is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Elon wants to be the host.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like
So
I like the
thanks for your
format too.
time. Yeah,
Oh, you're
really great
welcome.
discussion. And yeah, it will be interesting to revisit this. I hope I'm wrong about a lot of this stuff. I hope I'm just freaking out, but every time, I mean, I'm just seeing these data points. You just created front end to an LLM and you've never coded in your life. I mean,
Yeah, that would generally take 3 to 4 years of development experience and specific expertise in like a number of different domains. So that in itself is pretty mind blowing to me. And it does. I agree that maybe we're wrong on the timescale of a lot of this stuff, but the final thing I will say is I think you just have to have an awareness of where the wind is going and where the direction of these things are heading. And if anything, it might not completely replace the function that you're operating in, but you need to be leveraging these tools to the maximum capability with the latest cutting edge state of the art models to be able to augment your own workflow and to maintain a level of value that will be above what people who do not embrace these tools are at. So it's almost like a warning just to keep just to make sure that you're still advancing and you're progressing because it will become even more important to your point earlier to actually just retain your position in the workforce.
yeah, I like that these final thoughts and two things come to mind to me. One is if you're comforting yourself, telling yourself that, AI will never replace you, realize that it doesn't have to take your job. It just has to make someone else, you know, way more productive. And that if you are telling yourself this is just another one of those trends, this is like blockchain, everybody's talking about it, and in a year, everyone will have forgotten about it. I would really probe that and question that
Mm,
and be self-critical and do some research and get your hands dirty because
exactly.
to a lot of us, it's clear that is not the case.
No, completely agree, Greg. This has been a great conversation. Um, I hope that yeah we can continue these conversations and we because I'm very excited about the future of AI and to get your perspective on that has been really insightful for me personally. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks.